The Vietnam War was a long, complex conflict that began in the 1950s. It started as a struggle between the communist North Vietnam and the South Vietnamese government. The United States got involved to support South Vietnam. This was part of America's Cold War policy to stop the spread of communism. The war officially lasted from 1955 to 1975, but U.S. combat troops were there from 1965 to 1973. Vietnam had been a French colony. After World War II, the Vietnamese wanted independence and fought against the French, winning in 1954. The country was divided into North and South Vietnam. The North was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh, while the South was anti-communist, supported by the United States. Tensions grew as the North wanted to unify the country under communist rule and the South resisted. In the late 1950s, the Viet Cong began fighting against the South Vietnamese government, supported by North Vietnam. This escalated into a full-scale war, with the U.S. gradually increasing its involvement. By 1965, under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the U.S. sent combat troops, marking the beginning of a long and costly war. It would become one of the most controversial conflicts in American history, testing the limits of American power and changing the nation forever. The United States' failure in Vietnam was rooted in a series of political missteps. One of the biggest was a misunderstanding of the conflict's nature. American leaders saw it as part of the global fight against communism. But for many Vietnamese, it was a war for national independence. This fundamental misreading led to flawed strategies and policies. Another major mistake was the U.S. government's lack of clear, achievable goals. The objective of stopping communism was vague and hard to measure. It was difficult to know what victory would look like. This lack of clarity made it hard to develop effective strategies and explain the war's purpose to the American public. The U.S. also underestimated the resolve of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. American leaders believed that superior firepower and technology would quickly win the war. They didn't fully appreciate the enemy's determination and willingness to endure hardship. Lastly, the U.S. failed to build a stable, legitimate government in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese leaders were often corrupt and unpopular. Without a strong, credible ally in South Vietnam, the U.S. found itself fighting an uphill battle. These political failures laid the groundwork for America's ultimate defeat in Vietnam. The Vietnam War caused deep divisions in American society. As the conflict dragged on, it became increasingly unpopular. Many Americans, especially young people, questioned why the U.S. was fighting in a distant country. This led to widespread protests and social unrest. The anti-war movement gained strength in the mid-1960s. College campuses became centers of protest with teach-ins, demonstrations, and sit-ins. Students burned draft cards and resisted conscription. The slogan, "Make love, not war," became popular. The movement wasn't just about the war. It was part of a broader counterculture challenging traditional American values. The war also highlighted social inequalities at home. African Americans were disproportionately drafted and sent to fight, leading to increased tensions around civil rights issues. Many asked why they should fight for freedom abroad when they lacked full rights at home. The slogan, "No Viet Cong ever called me N," expressed this sentiment. The social upheaval reached a peak in 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. There were riots in many cities, and the Democratic National Convention in Chicago erupted in violence. The country seemed to be tearing itself apart. This social turmoil made it increasingly difficult for the government to maintain support for the war effort. The U.S. military's approach in Vietnam had several flaws. The strategy of attrition focused on killing enemy soldiers. This didn't work against an enemy willing to accept huge casualties. Emphasis on body counts led to exaggerated reports. The U.S. struggled with Viet Cong guerrilla tactics. Dense jungles negated America's technological advantage. Restrictions on operations limited effectiveness. These flaws hindered a U.S. military victory. Section 5. The Home Front, Public Opinion and Protests. As the Vietnam War dragged on, public opinion in the United States shifted dramatically. But as casualties mounted and the conflict seemed endless, support began to erode. The growing anti-war movement played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Protests became larger and more frequent. By 1967, hundreds of thousands were marching in Washington, D.C. By the late 1960s, the nation was deeply divided over the war. Section 6. Media's role bringing war into living rooms. The Vietnam War was often called the first television war. For the first time, the horrors of combat were broadcast directly into American homes. This had a profound impact on public opinion. Unlike previous wars, there was less censorship, and journalists had unprecedented access to the front lines. Television news played a crucial role in shaping perceptions of the war. Nightly news broadcasts showed graphic footage of battles and casualties, bringing the reality of war home to millions of Americans. The contrast between official statements of progress and the images on TV led to a credibility gap. People began to distrust what the government was telling them about the war. Print media also played a significant role, with newspapers and magazines publishing in-depth reports and analysis. Iconic photographs like the image of a naked girl fleeing a napalm attack had a powerful emotional impact. These images helped turn public opinion against the war. The media's coverage of key events was particularly influential. The Tet Offensive in 1968, though a military failure for the North Vietnamese, was portrayed as a sign that the war was unwinnable. The power of the media in shaping perceptions of the war was a new phenomenon, changing how future conflicts were reported and perceived. Section 7. Crucial battles, turning points in the conflict. Several key battles shaped the Vietnam War. The Battle of Ia Drang in 1965 was the first major engagement. The Americans won but suffered heavy casualties. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a significant turning point. It was a massive coordinated attack, striking cities across South Vietnam. Militarily, it failed for the communists, but was a psychological blow to American morale. Khe Sanh in 1968 symbolized American resolve. The Easter Offensive of 1972 was North Vietnam's largest attack, repelled by South Vietnamese forces. These battles shaped military strategy and public perception of the war. Section 8. The Tet Offensive. A psychological blow. The Tet Offensive, launched on January 30, 1968, was a turning point in the Vietnam War. It was a massive, coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The scale and suddenness of the attack shocked American and South Vietnamese forces. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was briefly occupied. It shattered American confidence in the war effort. President Johnson soon announced he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive marked the beginning of the end of American involvement. Section 9. Vietnamization, too little, too late. As public support for the war waned, the U.S. sought a way to reduce its involvement. This led to the policy of Vietnamization, introduced by President Richard Nixon in 1969. The idea was to gradually withdraw American troops while building up South Vietnam's military. The goal was for South Vietnam to take over the main combat role. Vietnamization involved several components. The U.S. provided massive amounts of military equipment to South Vietnam. American advisors trained South Vietnamese forces. At the same time, U.S. combat troops were steadily withdrawn. The number of American soldiers in Vietnam dropped from over 500,000 in 1968 to about 24,000 by late 1972. The policy had some successes, as South Vietnamese forces did improve their capabilities. They successfully repelled North Vietnam's Easter Offensive in 1972, albeit with heavy U.S. air support. But Vietnamization also had serious flaws. The South Vietnamese military remained dependent on U.S. aid and air power. Ultimately, Vietnamization proved to be too little, too late. It didn't address the fundamental weaknesses of the South Vietnamese government, and when U.S. aid was cut in 1974 to 75, South Vietnam quickly collapsed. Section 10. The Fall of Saigon, the Final Act. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 marked the end of the Vietnam War. It was a dramatic and chaotic conclusion to America's long involvement in the conflict. On April 29th, Operation Frequent Wind began, the final evacuation of American personnel and Vietnamese allies. On April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and the last Americans were airlifted out. The Vietnam War was over, ending in failure and humiliation for the United States. Section 11. Aftermath, long-lasting consequences for America. The Vietnam War had profound and long-lasting effects on American society and politics. The most immediate impact was on the nearly 3 million Americans who served in Vietnam. Many returned home with physical and psychological scars, facing challenges reintegrating into society. Some suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and other health issues. The plight of Vietnam veterans became a national concern. The war also changed America's view of itself and its role in the world. The notion of American exceptionalism was shaken, and the country's image as an unbeatable superpower was tarnished. This led to a period of national soul-searching affecting foreign policy for decades. The Vietnam Syndrome made Americans wary of foreign military interventions. Politically, the war's legacy was significant, contributing to a general distrust of government and the revelations of the Pentagon Papers, showing that officials had misled the public.